This is the Miller Philosopher. If any of you are familiar with my videos, then you know that in several of them, I have speculated that one of the reasons why many of the Noldor High Elves were so prejudiced against the Sindar Dark Elves of Beleriand was because of the circumstances that they first encountered them in. That when the first batch of the migration arrives in Middle-earth, they were attacked by Orc armies that had come up from the south, but they had successfully repelled them almost back to Angband, and after a couple more engagements, had not only completely routed the Orcs from the northern Beleriand, but the rest of the south as well, even though that particular Orc army had defeated the Sindar alliance that they had been fighting on the west end of that country. Thus, basically, the Noldor would found themselves in enemy-occupied territory that they would have to liberate, rather than meeting a powerful elven community that existed outside of Valinor in its own right. The armies of the Sindar, Dwarves, and Green Elves had successfully defeated the Orcs in eastern Beleriand, but the western portion, as I said, had been defeated before they went north to fight the Noldor. So, when Thingol sends a message to the recently united Noldor princes and new High King, Fingolfin, about his uneasiness at their arrival, half of them scoff because this High King of Beleriand did not seem all that high, given his forces getting their ass kicked and the rest being held up in a mystically protected border of Doriath, or on the coast on the west end of the country. That essentially, Thingol does not approach Noldor from a position of strength and is instead reliant on just basically his own reputation in elven courtesy. And it's implied, I think, that he really had no choice but to grant the newbies land for them to settle in. So, this begged the question for me. What if the Sindar armies in the western Beleriand had not been defeated? Now, this is going to be another fanfiction timeline, so if you don't want to hear it out, feel free to leave, it's okay. But if you're curious as I am, then hang on. Anyways, because I think there would have been major differences, but there's ultimately the same result as the main timeline. So, for one, the Sindar would have successfully fenced off Beleriand both east and west and driven the enemy north by themselves, as the pet would go in the main timeline in response to the fires at Lothgar by Feanor's arrival. And it's from here where things get kind of different, in that I think Feanor still would have died, mind you, because being consumed by his own madness and pursuing the enemy past his support and all. However, I think the Noldor would have encountered the Sindarin army for the first time as they were smashing the Orc armies in their press down south from the mountains. And the Orc army would have been destroyed between the hammer of the Noldor and the anvil of the Sindar. And this would be important because this would be the Noldor's first encounter with the Sindar, being a powerful elven culture that was more than capable of holding their own, and thus now being taken more seriously than they would be in the main timeline. After this, I think emissaries from both sides would meet, trying to establish long-forgotten connections and determine what the situation is, and when Fingolfin arrives with this portion of the Noldor, I think that part would still play out much the same. Maedhros is captured but rescued by Fingon, and then surrenders the high kingship of the Noldor to his uncle. Now, the Sindar would have been perplexed by the Noldor's internal politics like they were in the main timeline, but with a firm victory under their belt, there would have been no need for a magical barrier fencing Doriath, and Thingol's suspicions would remain the same, but when he delivers his questions about the Noldor's purposes and makes his boast about being the king of Beleriand, again, it's taken much more seriously. Some of the Noldor might still look down on the Sindar for being dark elves, but there would at least be a begrudging respect, similar to how in the main timeline the Noldor of East Beleriand saw the dwarves of the Blue Mountains. With this show of force, the Noldor would not have had as easy a time establishing individual realms across Beleriand because they would be forced to negotiate with Thingol rather than just letting him stew in his own ego. And both Fingolfin and Maedhros weren't of mind to start another war with other elves like they did in Alcalande. The main problem for the Sindar will continue to be numbers. They simply don't have the numbers needed to launch an offensive against anyone up north, even fresh after the victory south, let alone take on Morgoth directly. So, more than likely, the Noldor would still be concentrated up north, just like the main timeline. However, the realms would have to be shared among the princes, or, at the very least, some of them might have to suffer being vassals to Thingol in order to get lands in his territory, lest the Noldor risk war on two fronts. Speaking of which, I do think the children of Finarfin would still have been able to settle in western Beleriand because of their relation to Thingol, and therefore Nargothrond would still come to be, maybe even Gondolin itself if Thingol allows Turgon to visit Finrod. But the north would more or less be a firecracker always on the verge of cooking off because of this internal rivalry, and are now all pressed together. Now Maedhros was level-headed and still acknowledged as the head of the Sons of Fëanor, so between him and his uncle, they probably would have kept a lid on things. Also too, unless Melian convinces him otherwise, the Edain would not have come into Beleriand and would have been forced back east into Eriador because of Thingol's prejudice against mortals at that time. And put a pin in this, because this is going to have drastic consequences going forward. And this starts with the Third War of Beleriand, the Dagor Bragarlach, because that would have gone much more badly this time around in this version of events. That's because the bulk of the Noldor lords are now concentrated in one area, right next to Angband. Even in the main timeline, this war claimed the lives of Ngulfin, Angrod, and Aegnor, and the Sons of Fëanor barely held out. But this time, the casualties will be more severe, because Finrod, who comes up from the south in Nargothrond to reinforce the north, this time, when he gets trapped by the Orcs, gets no help from Barahir, because again, there are no mortals in Beleriand at this time. Also too, I believe at least some of the Sons of Fëanor would have been killed as well in the north. But this time the war might take a little bit longer for the Noldor to be cleared out, because the concentration of Noldor is much greater, because they're not as spread out as they are in the main timeline. However, with no allies for the Eldar to rely on to reinforce their own armies, I think that the Noldor in the north would have been scattered and separated, if not completely destroyed, just like what happens during the Battle of Unnumbered Tears in the main timeline. Morgoth's armies would engage the main Sindarin army, which again is going to be more powerful because they did not lose that particular first battle in the First War. Given that the enemy has got a new weapon of mass destruction in the form of Glaurung, the fire-breathing dragon, leading their eastern armies this time around, that the results would have played out much the same, but as a mirror image of what happened in the main timeline with the First War. That being that eastern Beleriand falls, whereas western Beleriand pretty much holds out. And I think it would be at this particular time that Melian would then cast her girdle. From here, this is where things start to get really dark in this timeline though, and where Thingol's pride and prejudice, no pun intended, does come to bite everybody in the ass. There's no humans in Beleriand in this timeline, as I said before. Therefore, there's not gonna be a meeting of Beren and Luthien, and therefore there will be no quest for the Silmarils either. And this is extremely important because it's this quest that in the main timeline kickstarts the real fall of the elves of Beleriand. So, without it, I think therefore the end for them comes much sooner. Nargothrond would still hold out, and with no Turin Turambar to encourage them to build a bridge to weaken their natural defenses of the river, therefore would still remain till the end. And with a stronger Sindar army in the southwestern portion of Beleriand, even with heavy losses, they would still fare better than their eastern faction. Not enough to win a war, but enough to remain as a holdout. Doriath and Hithlum would also probably still remain, because Hithlum has the mountains, because for whatever reason, Morgoth can't seem to advance an army beyond mountains for whatever reason, and because Doriath has got the magical girdle of Beleriand protecting it. Assuming that Turgon was allowed into Beleriand at the beginning, there may still be a Gondolin, and I think Gondolin still would have remained as well. And I think after a cooldown period because of the winter, that Glaurung would probably come back along down the eastern portion of Beleriand, now that that side has been taken over, and basically either entirely destroy the Green Elves or force them to flee to Doriath as refugees, which itself would then swell with their numbers, if not them being completely wiped out to begin with, and just basically cause havoc and destruction all across southern Beleriand, much further south than they did in the main timeline. And at this point, I think the Valar might be called upon by Uru to start the War of Wrath much sooner, because there is no emissary coming to Valinor, because again, no humans in this alternate timeline, because mortals are banned from Beleriand. They're all east of the Blue Mountains. The rest of the High Elves of Valinor arrive in force, like they do in the main timeline, but this time find themselves linking up with the surviving Noldor realms of Hithlum and Nargothrond, as well as any surviving Sindar armies that may be in the south. But at least in this version of the War of Wrath, it might not be as bad, surprisingly, as the main timeline version, because this version of Morgoth's army would not be as powerful as the one encountered in the Silmarillion, since Morgoth has not had time to basically evolve them and develop new tactics and weapons and new creatures to fight against the elves and humans. So essentially, no winged dragons and no Calagon the Black, which I think is tragic. But also too, that also might mean no smog? Interesting. So Beleriand might actually be saved from sinking this time around. Might. Also too, with no quest for the Silmaril, Thingol would not be killed, because there's no Silmaril to provoke him to acting like a douchebag in front of the dwarves. And we'll probably get a stern talking to from Eonwë, the Maiar Herald of Manwë and commander of the Valorian armies. Not only that, he outranks Melian in both as a Maiar and in power, so she would have to lower the barrier and pretty much submit to his authority, and most likely he would have compelled her return to Valinor like he does with the elves in the main timeline. Not forced, but compelled, so make of that what you will. And this would put Thingol in a very awkward position. Basically, either follow Melian back to Valinor if she goes, and thus fulfilling his original role from way back in the first age, and leaving his people in Beleriand again, or staying behind while Melian went back to Valinor with their daughter Luthien, whom is also still alive, but is now also still immortal at this time as well, because again, no mortals. But also too, the Sindar at least would be in a much better position numbers-wise, because Doriath would not have fallen, there was no war with the dwarves, and so on. I think the Noldor as well would still be compelled to return, and I can see Turgon for sure following the summons, given his infatuation with the past for the good old days, that inspired him to build Gondolin in the image of Tirion back in Valinor. However, I think Fingon, Orodreth, and Galadriel would remain. Fingon still being alive because there's no battle of unnumbered tears this time around, because again, no quest for the Silmarils. And Morgoth still being unable to break the defenses of the mountains as well. He most likely would have reunited with his uncle Finarfin, who had been High King of the Noldor in Valinor at this point, and had led the Noldor forces back to Middle-earth during the War of Wrath. I think that still would have happened. I think Fingon would follow after his father and stay in Middle-earth to lead the Noldor who would choose to remain, but would agree to submit to Finarfin as being the true High King of the Noldor, rather than having two High Kings in Arda, as what happens in the main timeline. That being said, what about any of the Sons of Fëanor who might still be alive during this time? Well, I think any who are still alive would still try to steal the Silmarils, but more or less the result's going to be the same. It's going to fail even if they manage to get their hands on them. All this essentially creates a drastically different Second Age, which I might say for a part 2, if you're interested. But having said all that, this is what I think would happen had the Sindar elves not lost the western portion of Beleriand during the very first war with Morgoth. But what do you guys think? Do you think that this prediction would be accurate? Or do you think something else would have happened entirely? Do you think that the Curse of Mandos would somehow been adjusted to basically make up for the differences in the timeline, or that more or less it becomes almost a moot point? Let me know in the comments below, but otherwise, this is the Middle-earth Philosopher, and you all have a good day.